Cigar smoke hung heavy over the velvet roulette tables, masking the sharp tang of spilled gin and desperation. Harper stood cornered in the shadows, an oversized wool coat swallowing her narrow shoulders. Aristocrats and mobsters laughed, their gazes sliding past her like she was a mud stain on the imported rugs. Suddenly, Gabriel Faust stopped walking. He ignored the glittering heiresses and the manicured escorts, his dark, hollow eyes locked onto Harper's trembling hands. "She'll do. I'll take her." Smoke burned the back of Harper's throat. It was a suffocating mix of cheap cherry tobacco and the acidic, nervous sweat of a dozen people who knew they were about to lose everything. The underground parlor beneath O'Leary's butcher shop didn't try to hide what it was. The faint, metallic ghost of raw meat still clung to the concrete walls, mingling with the heavy waft of expensive aftershave worn by men who killed for a living. Harper kept her eyes glued to the scuffed toes of her boots. Her left lace was frayed, tied in a clumsy knot. She focused on it. If she looked at the fraying threads, she didn't have to look at her father, Arthur, who was currently sweating through his polyester suit 3 feet away. She didn't have to look at the ledger on the mahogany table that proved he owed $3 million. And she didn't have to look at the line of polished, terrified women standing against the far wall, collateral. There were 5 of them. Daughters of gamblers, sisters of thieves. They were dressed to appease, silk dresses, pushed-up cleavage, tear-streaked but perfectly contoured faces. And then there was Harper. She hadn't been prepped for this. Arthur had dragged her out of bed at 2 a.m, her oversized grey sweater dotted with bleach stains from her shift at the diner, her hair pulled back in a greasy, uneven ponytail. She looked exactly like what she was, a tired 24-year-old waitress with a bruised jaw from a customer who hadn't liked his eggs. Beside the silk-clad women, she looked like a stray dog that had wandered into a dog show. Laughter bounced off the low ceiling. A man with a thick gold chain and a neck like a tree trunk pointed a fat finger in her direction. "Arthur, you brought us a rat to pay off a tiger. Look at her. A stiff breeze would snap her in half. She ain't even worth $100 on the corner." The men around him chuckled, the sound wet and ugly. Harper felt a hot flush of shame crawl up her neck. But she didn't cry. Crying took energy. She just dug her fingernails into the palms of her hands until crescent moons of white appeared. She hated them, but mostly she hated herself for hoping her father would defend her. He didn't. He just wrung his hands, his eyes darting toward the heavy steel door at the back of the room. The air shifted. It wasn't a dramatic gust of wind or a booming announcement. It was a sudden, localized drop in temperature, followed by a total, suffocating silence. The laughter died in the men's throats. The clinking of whiskey glasses ceased. Even Arthur stopped sweating for a fraction of a second, his breath hitching. Gabriel Faust had arrived. He walked into the room without rushing. No bodyguards flanked him, which only made him more terrifying. A man who walked alone into a room of vipers usually owned the fangs. He wore a charcoal suit that absorbed the dim light, tailored so sharply it looked like armor. He smelled of rain on asphalt and something bitter. Black coffee. Firewood. Gabriel didn't look at the mobsters. He didn't look at Arthur. He walked straight toward the line of women. Harper's stomach executed a slow, sickening roll. She wanted to be brave. She wanted to lift her chin and glare at the monster who owned half the city's illegal ports. Instead, her knees knocked together. Her bladder gave a pathetic, terrifying twinge. She swallowed hard, the dry click sounding deafening in her own ears. Gabriel paused in front of the first woman, a gorgeous redhead, trembling in a green slip dress. He barely registered her. He moved down the line. A blonde, a brunette. He was shopping for produce, checking for bruises, except he wasn't even touching them. He was looking at their eyes. Then he reached the end of the line. He stood in front of Harper. Up close, he didn't look like a cartoon villain. There were deep, purple bags under his eyes. A faint, silvery scar cut through his left eyebrow. He looked exhausted. He looked hollowed out, like someone had scraped the humanity out of his skull with a spoon and left only a cold, calculating machine behind. He stared at her. Harper stared back, unable to break the magnetism of his dead gaze. She smelled the peppermint on his breath. She saw the microscopic fray on the collar of his custom shirt. "Mr. Faust," Arthur stammered from the side, his voice cracking. I have the deed to the house. The girl is just... she's nothing. Don't mind her. I'll get you the rest by Tuesday." Gabriel didn't break eye contact with Harper. His eyes dropped to the bleach stains on her sweater, then to the ugly purple bruise on her jawline. A cruel smirk played on the lips of the mobster with the gold chain. "Leave the street trash, Faust. Take the redhead. The ugly one ain't fit to scrub your floors." Harper braced herself for the dismissal. She waited for the sneer, for the turn of his heel. She had been passed over, mocked, and discarded her entire life. It was safe. Invisibility was her armor. Gabriel tilted his head a fraction of an inch. He lifted a hand. Harper flinched, a full, ugly, unheroic flinch, her shoulders hiking up to her ears, eyes squeezing shut. She waited for the backhand. It never came. Instead, Gabriel's knuckles brushed the coarse wool of her cheap sweater. A fleeting, almost clinical touch. He dropped his hand and finally turned to the room. "She'll do," Gabriel said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that vibrated in the soles of Harper's boots. "I'll take her." The room exhaled in a collective gasp of disbelief. Arthur dropped his ledger. The redhead in the slip dress let out a choked sob of relief. Harper just stood there, her brain short-circuiting. "What? Her?" the fat mobster barked, losing his fear in his confusion. "Are you blind, Faust? She's a walking skeleton. She's got nothing." Gabriel's gaze slid to the mobster. The temperature in the room plummeted further. "Her father's debt is settled," Gabriel said softly, dangerously softly. "And if you ever speak about my property like that again, I will have your tongue served to you on a very expensive plate." Silence slammed back down over the room. Gabriel looked back at Harper. "Walk," he commanded. Harper didn't argue. She didn't spit in his face or declare her independence. Her survival instincts, honed over 2 decades of abuse and poverty, overrode her pride. She picked up her feet and walked. The alleyway behind the butcher shop smelled of rotting cabbage and wet dumpster iron. Harper hit the cold night air and immediately started shivering. Her teeth clicked together like cheap castanets. A massive black SUV idled by the curb. A man built like a brick wall opened the rear door. Gabriel slid in first, moving with an eerie, liquid grace. Harper hesitated on the asphalt. The dark interior of the car looked like a gaping maw. "Get in!" Gabriel's voice floated out from the darkness. It wasn't a request. She scrambled in, awkwardly banging her knee against the doorframe. She hissed in pain, grabbing her leg, feeling her cheeks burn. Graceful, real graceful, Harper. The heavy door chunked shut behind her, sealing them inside a soundproof vault. The city noise, the sirens, the distant rumble of the L train, was instantly muted. Inside the car, the air smelled of rich, unblemished leather, ozone from the air conditioning, and that lingering scent of black coffee and firewood from Gabriel. The SUV pulled away from the curb smoothly. Harper pressed herself against the opposite door, trying to make herself as small as physically possible. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her oversized sweater around her legs. Her heart was beating so fast it felt like a trapped bird battering against her ribs. She stole a glance at him. Gabriel was looking out the window. The passing streetlights strobed across his sharp profile, illuminating the harsh lines of his jaw and the cold indifference in his eyes. He didn't look at her. He didn't gloat. He didn't look like a man who had just bought a woman to pay off a $3 million debt. He looked bored. 10 minutes passed in agonizing silence. The hum of the tires on the asphalt was the only sound. Then betrayal struck from within. Harper's stomach let out a loud, hollow, reverberating growl. She froze. The sound was deafening in the quiet luxury of the car. She hadn't eaten since a stale piece of toast 20 hours ago. Heat flooded her face, burning all the way to the tips of her ears. She clamped a hand over her abdomen, mortified. Of all the times for her body to remind her, it was alive. Gabriel didn't turn his head. He didn't laugh. He slowly reached into the console between them. Harper flinched again, bracing herself against the door panel, her breath catching in her throat. Gabriel's hand emerged, holding a silver foil wrapper. He tossed it onto the seat between them. It was a dark chocolate protein bar. Harper stared at it. She looked at his hand, tracing the thick, raised veins on the back of his knuckles, then up to his face. He was still staring out the window. "Eat," he said, his tone flat. "I don't need you passing out on my carpets. Blood is notoriously hard to get out of silk." The dark humor missed her completely. Her hands were shaking so badly it took her 3 tries to peel back the foil. The wrapper crinkled loudly, a violent noise in the quiet car. She took a bite. The chocolate was rich, cloying, coating the roof of her dry mouth. She forced herself to chew, her throat tight with a bizarre mixture of gratitude and terror. "Why me?" she blurted out. The words bypassed her brain and slipped through her lips before she could stop them. She clamped her mouth shut instantly, terrified she had crossed a line. Gabriel slowly turned his head. The streetlights caught the amber flecks in his dark eyes. He looked at her chewed-up fingernails, the bleach stains on her clothes, the desperate, hollow curve of her cheeks. "You're quiet," he said finally, "and you have no illusions about what the world is. The others—" He sneered, a tiny, ugly twisting of his upper lip. "They think they can charm their way out. They think they can bargain with their bodies or their tears. I don't have the patience for delusions." He leaned his head back against the headrest, closing his eyes. "You know you're nothing," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "That makes you infinitely easier to manage." The words felt like a physical slap. They weren't cruel in delivery. They were stated as an objective fact. It hurt because it was exactly what she believed about herself. She was nothing. She had no leverage, no hidden beauty waiting to be uncovered, no fiery spirit. She was just tired. Harper swallowed the lump of dry chocolate. She didn't ask any more questions. She looked out the tinted window as the gritty streets of the Lower East Side faded into the sprawling, gated estates of the northern hills. She wasn't a princess being rescued from a dragon. She was just a stray dog being moved from a rusty cage into a gilded one. And the man sitting next to her didn't want a companion. He wanted a ghost. The wrought-iron gates swung open with a heavy, oiled groan. The SUV crunched over a long, circular gravel driveway, coming to a halt before a massive, grey stone manor. It looked less like a home and more like a mausoleum. No warm lights spilled from the windows. The architecture was sharp, Gothic, and unforgiving. "Out," Gabriel said, opening his door. Harper scrambled out of her side, her legs stiff and aching. The northern air was significantly colder here, biting through the thin fabric of her jeans. She hugged her elbows, looking up at the imposing stone facade. Gabriel didn't wait for her. He stalked up the wide marble steps. The front door was opened by a stern-looking older woman in a crisp grey dress. "Mr. Faust," the woman said, bowing her head slightly. "Martha, put her in the East Wing guest room," Gabriel commanded, not breaking his stride as he walked into the cavernous foyer. He began shrugging off his suit jacket. "Throw away whatever rags she's wearing. Have the doctor look at her face tomorrow." "Yes, sir." Martha turned her sharp, assessing gaze to Harper. Harper stood frozen in the doorway. The foyer smelled of lemon polish and beeswax. The floors were black marble, gleaming like a polished mirror. She felt intensely aware of the mud on her boots. Gabriel stopped at the base of a grand, sweeping staircase. He half-turned, his eyes catching Harper's. "Do not try to leave. The perimeter is electrified, and the dogs are not trained to warn." With that, he ascended the stairs, disappearing into the shadows of the upper floor. "Come along," Martha said. Her voice wasn't unkind, but it wasn't warm either. It was the voice of a woman who was paid to do a job and did it efficiently. Harper followed the housekeeper. Her boots squeaked embarrassingly against the marble. They walked down a long, dimly lit corridor. Paintings of bleak landscapes hung on the walls. No family portraits. No photos. The house felt entirely devoid of love. Martha opened a heavy oak door and flipped a switch. Soft, warm light flooded the room. Harper stopped in the threshold, her breath catching. The room was larger than the entire apartment she had shared with her father. A massive, four-poster bed sat in the center, draped in heavy, cream-colored linens. A stone fireplace occupied one wall. The carpet was thick, plush, and a deep, royal blue. "The bathroom is through there," Martha pointed. "Towels are inside. Leave your clothes in the basket by the door. I will provide you with sleepwear. Dinner will be brought up in an hour." Martha stepped out and pulled the door shut with a solid click. Harper heard the lock engage from the outside. She stood alone in the center of the massive room. The silence was absolute. It pressed against her eardrums. She slowly walked toward the bed and reached out, running a calloused, chapped hand over the silk duvet cover. The fabric caught on the rough skin of her fingertips. It was the softest thing she had ever touched. A sudden, overwhelming wave of exhaustion hit her, buckling her knees. She sank to the floor, right there on the plush blue carpet. She pulled her knees up to her chest and buried her face in her arms. She expected to cry. She waited for the tears, for the panic attack, for the screaming realization that she had been sold to a mafia boss, but her eyes remained dry. Instead, a strange, hollow numbness settled over her. She was locked in a room. She was a prisoner. But the carpet was soft. The room was warm. For the first time in 3 years, she didn't have to figure out how to pay the electric bill by Tuesday. She dragged herself up off the floor and walked into the bathroom. It was a palace of white marble and brass fixtures. A massive soaking tub sat in the corner. She stripped off her clothes, the oversized sweater, the cheap, faded jeans, the frayed bra. She kicked them into the wicker basket. Stepping into the shower, she turned the brass knob. Hot water blasted out, hitting her skin like liquid fire. She hissed, adjusting the temperature, letting the steam fill the glass enclosure. She grabbed a bottle of heavy, expensive body wash that smelled of bergamot and cedar. As she scrubbed the grime and sweat of the butcher's basement off her skin, the soap stung the bruised skin along her jawline. She traced the purpling flesh with wet fingers. Arthur had done that, backhanding her when she had initially refused to get in his car earlier that night. She rinsed the suds away, watching the greyish water spiral down the drain. She wondered what Gabriel Faust wanted with a ghost. He said she was easy to manage, but men like him didn't acquire things just to put them in a quiet room. He would want something eventually. She turned off the water and stepped out, wrapping herself in a towel so thick it felt like a weighted blanket. When she walked back into the bedroom, a simple white cotton nightgown was laid out on the bed. But it was a silver tray holding a bowl of thick, creamy potato soup, a crusty roll of bread, and a glass of water. Harper's stomach cramped again, violently this time. She didn't care about dignity. She practically dove onto the edge of the bed, dragging the tray onto her lap. She didn't use the spoon. She picked up the bowl and drank the soup directly, the hot, rich liquid scalding her tongue. It tasted like heaven. It tasted like survival. She shoved the bread into her mouth, chewing frantically, crumbs tumbling down her chin. She was halfway through the bowl when she heard a sound. The click of the door unlocking. Harper froze, the bowl hovering an inch from her mouth. A drop of soup fell from her bottom lip onto her collarbone. The door pushed open. Gabriel stood in the doorway. He had shed his suit jacket and tie. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and laced with faded ink. He held a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He stopped, staring at her. Harper sat frozen on the edge of the bed, wearing nothing but a towel, a bowl clutched in both hands, cheeks stuffed with bread like a terrified chipmunk. She looked pathetic. She looked exactly like the street trash the mobsters had called her. She waited for the disgust to register on his face. She waited for him to sneer. Instead, Gabriel's eyes dropped to the bowl in her hands, then back to her wide, panicked eyes. A muscle feathered in his jaw. For a fraction of a second, the cold, dead machine slipped. Something else flared in the dark depths of his gaze. Something raw, heavy, and intensely human. He took a slow sip of his bourbon. "Chew," he murmured, his voice a low, raspy scrape in the quiet room. "I told you. I don't want you choking on my carpets." He didn't step into the room. He just pulled the door shut behind him, the lock clicking back into place, leaving Harper alone with her racing heart and the lingering scent of smoke and peppermint in the air. Morning came not with a gentle dawn, but with a harsh, grey light that sliced through the gap in the heavy curtains. Harper woke up tangled in the silk sheets, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. For 3 seconds, she didn't know where she was. She braced for the sound of Arthur coughing up phlegm in the next room, for the rumble of the garbage trucks down in the alley. Silence answered her. Total, suffocating silence. Memory crashed over her like a bucket of ice water. The butcher shop, the ledger, Gabriel Faust. She sat up, pulling the thick cotton of the provided nightgown tight across her collarbones. Her jaw throbbed, a dull, rhythmic ache radiating up to her temple. The bruise Arthur had given her felt tight and hot to the touch. A sharp knock rapped at the oak door. Before she could answer, the lock clicked. Martha entered, carrying a stack of folded clothes. Behind her walked a short, balding man, carrying a scuffed leather bag. He smelled overwhelmingly of rubbing alcohol and peppermint antacids. "Dr. Gibson is here," Martha announced, setting the clothes on the end of the bed. "Mr. Faust requested an evaluation." Harper pulled her knees to her chest. She hated doctors. Doctors asked questions. They looked at the fading yellow marks on her ribs and the jagged, poorly healed scar on her shin, and their eyes always filled with that useless, pitying warmth. "I'm fine," she croaked. Her voice was raspy from disuse and the lingering smoke of the underground parlor. Dr. Gibson didn't offer a warm smile. He didn't introduce himself. He just walked over to the bed, popped the clasps on his bag, and pulled out a penlight. "Look at the wall behind me," he instructed, his tone entirely bored. He flashed the light into her pupils. Harper flinched, her eyes watering. "Concussion?" he asked, pressing two cold, latex-clad fingers against the purple flesh of her jaw. Harper hissed, jerking her head away. No. Just hit. He rummaged in his bag. Lift the gown. Need to check for broken ribs. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in her gut. She looked at Martha, who stood by the door like a stone gargoyle, then back at the doctor. No. I said I'm fine. Nothing is broken. Miss, Gibson sighed, sounding profoundly tired. I get paid whether I examine you or not. But if you collapse from a punctured lung later today, Gabriel will break my fingers. Lift the gown. The mention of Gabriel's name stripped the fight out of her. The memory of his dead, hollow eyes in this underground parlor flashed behind her eyelids. Her fingers trembling, she gathered the hem of the white cotton and pulled it up to just beneath her breasts. The doctor didn't leer. He didn't even really look at her. He pressed his stethoscope against her pale skin, listening. He prodded her ribs with blunt, unsympathetic fingers. It hurt. A sharp, localized pain where Arthur had kicked her 2 weeks ago, but she bit the inside of her cheek to keep from making a sound. Malnourished, Gibson muttered, making a note on a small pad. Vitamin D deficiency, clearly. Blood pressure is low. Ribs are bruised, not fractured. Put it down. Harper dropped the hem, her face burning. Gibson tossed a small, orange plastic bottle onto the mattress. Take 2 of these for the swelling. Eat real food. Red meat, iron. Martha, see to it she drinks a gallon of water a day. Her skin looks like tracing paper. Understood, Doctor, Martha said. Gibson snapped his bag shut and walked out without another word. Martha gestured to the folded clothes. Get dressed. You are free to roam the ground floor and the gardens within the perimeter. Do not go down to the basement. Do not enter the west wing. Lunch is at 1. Wait, Harper said, as Martha turned to leave. The housekeeper paused, her grey eyebrows raising a fraction of an inch. What? What does he want me to do? Martha looked at her for a long, calculating moment. Mr. Faust did not leave instructions regarding your activities. I suggest you stay out of the way. The door clicked shut. The lock engaged again. Harper exhaled a shaky breath. Stay out of the way. She was a master at that. She had spent her entire life trying to take up as little space as possible. She crawled to the end of the bed and inspected the clothes. There was nothing glamorous about them. No silk slips, no tight dresses. It was a pair of thick, grey cashmere sweatpants, a plain black long-sleeved t-shirt, and a pair of thick wool socks. It was clothing meant for someone you didn't want to look at. She stripped off the nightgown and pulled the clothes on. The cashmere was absurdly soft against her rough skin. It felt entirely wrong. She felt like an imposter wrapped in stolen luxury. She swallowed 2 of the pills Gibson had left, dry swallowing them because there was no water left in the room. Then she walked to the heavy oak door. She grabbed the brass handle, expecting resistance. It turned smoothly. Martha hadn't locked it. The click she heard must have just been the heavy latch falling into place. She was free to roam, inside the cage. 2 days bled into 3. The house operated on a rhythm of ghostly efficiency. Meals appeared on schedule. Thick steaks, roasted vegetables, hearty stews. Harper ate everything until she felt sick, a reflex from years of not knowing when her next meal would come. She didn't see Gabriel. The Greystone Manor was massive, an endless labyrinth of dark wood paneling, Persian rugs, and closed doors. She followed Martha's rules. She stayed on the ground floor. She sat in the library, a massive room filled with thousands of books that smelled of aging paper and floor wax. She didn't read. She just sat in a leather armchair by the window, watching the rain lash against the thick glass, staring at the electrified wrought-iron fence in the distance. She was waiting for the bill to come due. Men didn't spend $3 million on a woman just to let her sit in a library and eat expensive beef. Every time she heard a footstep echo in the hallway, her stomach clenched. She waited for Gabriel to walk in, demand she strip, or put her to work, scrubbing the endless miles of marble flooring. But nothing happened. The isolation began to itch under her skin, a different kind of torture. On the fourth evening, the storm outside worsened. Thunder rattled the window panes. Harper was sitting in her usual spot in the library, her knees pulled to her chest, a thick book on European history sitting unopened in her lap. The heavy mahogany doors to the library groaned open. Harper flinched, her book slipping from her lap and hitting the floor with a loud thud. Gabriel walked in. He looked worse than he had at the butcher shop. His charcoal suit was rumpled. His tie was loosened, hanging crookedly around his neck. The bags under his eyes were bruised and heavy, turning the skin a sickly shade of violet. His knuckles were wrapped in white medical tape, and a dark, rust-colored stain smeared the cuff of his white shirt. Blood. Harper's breath caught in her throat. She pressed herself deeper into the leather armchair, trying to blend into the shadows. Gabriel didn't look at her. He walked straight to a low table near the fireplace where a crystal decanter sat. He poured a generous measure of amber liquid into a glass, his taped knuckles stiff and clumsy. He downed it in one swallow, his throat working. He poured another. He finally turned, leaning heavily against the table, and looked into the corner where Harper sat, frozen. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. The only sound was the rain hammering against the glass and the faint hiss of the embers in the fireplace. "You flinch," Gabriel said. His voice was hoarse, stripped of its usual resonant hum. It sounded like cracked gravel. "Every time a door opens, every time a floorboard creaks, you flinch." Harper didn't answer. Her mouth was completely dry. "It's exhausting to watch," he muttered, taking a slow sip of his second drink. He closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the edge of a towering bookshelf. "I didn't bring you here to beat you." "Why did you bring me here?" she'd whispered. The words slipped out before her survival instincts could clamp her jaw shut. Gabriel opened his eyes. They were completely devoid of light. "Because Arthur was going to sell you to a man named Declan. Declan likes to use hunting knives on the women he buys. He likes to see how long they can scream before their vocal cords give out." Harper's stomach dropped out. A cold sweat broke across her hairline. She knew Arthur was a rat. She knew he was desperate. But the blunt, clinical way Gabriel delivered the information made the horror absolute. "I bought you because I owed your grandfather a favor from 20 years ago," Gabriel continued, his voice flat. "The debt is paid. You're here. You're breathing." He looked down at the blood on his cuff, his expression twisting into something deeply ugly. "Don't make me regret my charity. Stop looking at me like I'm the one holding the knife." Anger, sudden, hot and entirely unfamiliar, flared in Harper's chest. It burned through the fear, surprising her. "You brought me here like a piece of meat," she shot back, her voice shaking badly, but louder than a whisper. "You lock me in this house. You don't speak to me. You walk in covered in blood. How am I supposed to look at you?" Gabriel paused. The glass hovered near his mouth. He looked at her, really looked at her, the exhaustion in his face shifting into a cold, dangerous focus. He pushed off the table and walked toward her. Harper's surge of bravery instantly evaporated. She shrank back, her fingernails digging into the leather armrests. "Stupid, stupid." "Shut your mouth, Harper." Gabriel stopped 2 feet away. He loomed over her, a massive wall of dark wool, stale sweat, copper, and rain. He didn't raise his hand. He just stared down at her trembling frame. "You want to know what I am?" he asked softly, dangerously. "I am the reason you aren't bleeding out on a dirty mattress right now. I am the reason you have warm food in your stomach. And yes, I am the monster who does the things that keep this house quiet." He leaned down, placing a taped, blood-stained knuckle on the armrest, trapping her in the chair. His face was inches from hers. She could smell the bourbon on his breath. "You don't have to like it," he whispered. "You don't have to like me. But don't ever mistake my indifference for cruelty. If I wanted to hurt you, you'd already be broken." He straightened up, picking up his glass from the table. He turned his back on her and walked toward the door. "Read your book, Harper," he threw over his shoulder. "And stop dropping things." The doors closed behind him with a heavy, final thud. Harper sat in the chair for a full hour, her chest heaving, staring at the spot where he had stood. Her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't pick the book up off the floor. The peace broke on a Tuesday at 2 a.m. Harper was awake. Her insomnia, a lifelong companion, had flared up. She lay in the massive 4-poster bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the absolute silence of the house. The thick wool socks Martha had provided kept her feet too warm, so she pushed the heavy blankets off and swung her legs over the side of the mattress. She needed a glass of water. She padded barefoot out of her bedroom. The hallway was pitched in total darkness. The soft glow of the emergency lights near the baseboards cast long, distorted shadows against the walls. The air was frigid. She made her way toward the main staircase, trailing her fingers along the cold wood paneling to keep her bearings. As she reached the top of the stairs, a sound shattered the quiet. Crack. It wasn't a natural sound. It was sharp, loud, and brutally abrupt. It echoed from the ground floor, vibrating through the soles of Harper's feet. Before her brain could process the noise, another sound followed. The unmistakable, agonizing screech of tearing metal, followed by the heavy, chaotic crunch of glass raining down onto marble. Harper froze. Her breath hitched, trapping itself in her lungs. A heavy, guttural shout tore through the foyer below. It was a man's voice, thick with adrenaline. "Sweep the perimeter! Find him!" They were inside. Every instinct Harper had, honed over years of living with a volatile, gambling father, screamed at her to run, to hide, to make herself microscopic. She dropped to her knees, pressing her back against the wall at the top of the staircase, her hands flying to cover her mouth to muffle her own ragged breathing. Footsteps thundered on the floor below, heavy boots against marble. "West Wing is clear!" someone yelled. "Check the stairs!" Another voice barked. Harper squeezed her eyes shut. She was going to die in a cashmere sweater in a house she didn't belong in. Suddenly, a hand clamped over her mouth. Harper screamed against the palm, her entire body thrashing violently. She kicked out, her bare heel connecting with solid bone. A suppressed grunt sounded above her. "Stop moving." The voice was a harsh, raspy whisper directly in her ear. "Gabriel." He didn't let go of her mouth. His other arm wrapped around her waist, hauling her backward. He dragged her away from the top of the stairs, sliding along the wall into the deeper shadows of the corridor. He pulled her into an alcove behind a heavy marble bust. It was a tight fit. He pressed her back flush against the wall, his own body crowding against hers. He removed his hand from her mouth, but kept his arm braced across her chest, pinning her in place. "Not a sound," he breathed, his face inches from hers. Harper nodded frantically, her chest heaving against his arm. In the dark, she couldn't see his face clearly, but she could smell him. Gun oil, peppermint, and the sharp, acidic tang of pure adrenaline. He was wearing just a black t-shirt and dark pants. In his right hand, hanging down by his side, the dull metal of a heavy pistol caught the faint emergency light. Footsteps began pounding up the marble staircase. Clack, clack, clack. They were slow, deliberate. Someone was coming up. Gabriel's body went completely rigid. He didn't breathe. He felt like a coiled spring, a predator waiting in the absolute dark. Harper realized with a sickening jolt of clarity that he wasn't hiding out of fear. He was waiting for the perfect angle. A beam of a flashlight swept across the top of the landing, slicing through the darkness. The beam bounced off the walls, inching closer to the alcove. Harper closed her eyes. She wanted to sink through the floorboards. She felt Gabriel shift his weight slightly. The arm across her chest tightened, a silent command to stay put. A man stepped into the corridor. He wore a dark, tactical vest and carried a short, suppressed rifle. He swept the flashlight beam left, then right. He took a step toward the marble bust. Gabriel moved. It was too fast for Harper to comprehend. 1 second, he was pressing her against the wall. The next, he was a blur of violence in the hallway. There was no cinematic dialogue, no warning. Gabriel lunged out of the alcove. He grabbed the barrel of the intruder's rifle with his left hand, shoving it sharply upward. The suppressed weapon let out a muted foot, tearing chunks of plaster out of the ceiling. Simultaneously, Gabriel drove the heavy steel butt of his own pistol directly into the man's throat. The crunch of collapsing cartilage was nauseatingly loud. The intruder dropped the rifle, his hands flying to his ruined throat, a wet, gurgling sound escaping his lips. Gabriel didn't pause. He stepped in, sweeping the man's leg out from under him, sending him crashing onto his back on the hardwood floor. Gabriel stood over him and fired 2 shots point-blank into the man's chest. Bang! Bang! In the confined hallway, the unsuppressed gunfire was deafening. Harper clapped her hands over her ears, crying out as a sharp ring pierced her eardrums. The smell of cordite and burned powder instantly filled the air, acrid and choking. Downstairs, shouting erupted. "He's upstairs! Move!" Gabriel didn't look back at her. He didn't check to see if she was okay. The exhaustion was gone from his posture, replaced by a terrifying, absolute lethality. He stepped over the bleeding body on the floor, raised his pistol, and walked toward the top of the stairs to meet the rest of them. Gunshots tore through the lower level, a deafening, chaotic rhythm that vibrated up through the floorboards and rattled Harper's teeth. She stayed crammed in the dark alcove, her knees pulled so tightly to her chest that her joints screamed. Downstairs, men shouted in a frantic, overlapping panic. Glass shattered, wood splintered. Harper pressed her hands over her ears, shutting her eyes until rockets of light exploded behind her eyelids. She didn't pray. Growing up with Arthur had beaten the religion out of her by the time she was 9. Instead, she focused on the gritty texture of the plaster dust coating the hardwood floor beneath her bare toes. She counted her own shallow, ragged breaths. 1, 2, 3. The gunfire didn't last long. Real violence rarely did. It wasn't a movie shootout that dragged on for 20 minutes. It was a sudden, explosive release of lethal pressure, followed by a thick, heavy silence that was somehow more terrifying than the noise. Then, the smell hit her. It drifted up the grand staircase. Cordite, burned carpet, and beneath the chemical burn of the gunpowder, the heavy, sweet, metallic stench of fresh blood. Harper didn't move. Her muscles were locked in a rigid state of paralysis. She waited for the heavy boots of the intruders to come stomping up the stairs. She waited for the flashlight beam to find her hiding behind the marble bust. Footsteps sounded on the landing, slow, dragging. A wet cough echoed in the dark corridor. Harper opened her eyes. The emergency lights cast a sickly, yellow glow over the top of the stairs. Gabriel pulled himself up the final step. He wasn't a blur of lethal grace anymore. He leaned heavily against the wood-paneled wall, his breath coming in shallow, ragged rasps. His left hand was pressed tightly against his lower right side. Dark, thick liquid seeped between his fingers, dripping onto the pristine floorboards with a soft, rhythmic pat, pat, pat. He stopped, his head hanging low, staring at the floor. He coughed again, spitting a thick wad of red onto the rug. Harper stayed frozen. Her mind screamed at her to stay hidden. He was a monster. He had just slaughtered people downstairs. If she stayed quiet, maybe he would bleed out right there in the hallway, and she could walk out the front door in the morning. But Gabriel slowly turned his head. His dark eyes found her in the shadows of the alcove. He didn't ask for help. He didn't say a word. He just looked at her, his face pale and completely drained of its usual terrifying composure. He took one step toward his bedroom, his leg buckling. He hit the floor hard, his shoulder slamming into the wall, smearing a wide, ugly arc of crimson against the expensive wallpaper. Harper's breath caught. She stared at the man bleeding out on the floor. Survival. Her brain chanted the word. Survival means staying out of the way. But a deeper, darker realization gripped her. If Gabriel died, whoever sent those men would own the house. They would find her. Declan, or someone exactly like him, would walk up those stairs, and Gabriel wouldn't be there to put a bullet in their chests. Harper scrambled out of the alcove. Her bare feet slipped on the plaster dust, but she caught her balance and ran to him. She dropped to her knees beside him. Up close, the smell of copper was nauseating. His black t-shirt was soaked through, clinging to his torso like a second skin. "Get up!" Harper hissed, her voice cracking. She grabbed his thick, heavy bicep, pulling with all her meager weight. "You can't stay here." Gabriel's eyes fluttered open. He looked at her, a faint, bitter smile touching the corner of his pale lips. "I told you, to stay out of the way." "Shut up!" she snapped, panic overriding her fear of him. "Get up, come on!" She wedged her shoulder under his left arm, bracing her feet against the floorboards. Gabriel let out a low, guttural groan, digging his boots into the wood, and forced himself upward. His weight was crushing. He felt like a slab of solid granite pressing her down. Together they hobbled down the corridor toward his bedroom. Every step was a battle. Harper's lungs burned, her cashmere sweatpants slipping down her hips. She could feel the hot, sticky dampness of his blood soaking into her own shirt. They made it through his heavy bedroom doors and into the massive, sterile, white expanse of his master bathroom. "Tub!" Gabriel ground out, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like the bone might snap. Harper steered him toward the massive marble-soaking tub. He practically collapsed over the edge, sliding down onto the cold tile floor, leaning his back against the porcelain. "Towels," he ordered, his eyes closing, his head falling back against the tub. "Cabinet." Harper scrambled to the tall glass cabinet, ripping out 3 thick white bath towels. She dropped to her knees beside him. "Move your hand," she said. Her own hands were shaking so violently she could barely grip the cotton. Gabriel's hand fell away. The wound was ugly. It wasn't a clean puncture. A bullet had grazed him heavily, tearing a deep, jagged trench through the muscle of his right oblique. It was bleeding sluggishly, the dark arterial blood pooling in the creases of his ruined shirt. Harper didn't think. If she thought about it, she would vomit. She bunched up the towel and pressed it directly against the tear in his flesh. Gabriel's entire body went rigid. A raw, animalistic hiss tore through his teeth, his head snapping forward. His hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around Harper's wrist with bone-crushing force. "Harder!" he ground out, his eyes blazing into hers, completely dilated with pain. "Press harder, Harper." She leaned all her weight onto her hands, pressing the towel deep into the wound. Gabriel's grip on her wrist tightened until she felt her own pulse throbbing against his fingers. But he didn't look away from her. They stayed like that for what felt like hours. The only sounds in the bright, sterile bathroom were their jagged, matching breaths. Harper stared at the thick, raised scars crisscrossing his exposed collarbone and neck. This man didn't live in a gilded cage. He lived in an abattoir. He was covered in the geography of 100 violent nights, just like this one. "Why didn't you run?" Gabriel asked softly, his voice barely a rasp. Harper kept her weight on the towel. The white cotton was already soaking through, turning a deep, wet crimson. "Where would I go?" she asked bitterly. "Back to the diner? Back to Arthur? I'd be dead in a week." Gabriel's thumb brushed against the inside of her wrist, a slow, deliberate movement. "You're practical. I always liked that about you." "You don't know anything about me," she retorted, staring at the blood seeping between her fingers. "I know your grandfather pulled my father out of a burning car in Queens 22 years ago," Gabriel said, his chest rising and falling heavily beneath her hands. "I know he lost 3 fingers doing it. I know your father took the insurance money and drank it, leaving you to wear clothes out of donation bins." Harper's jaw tightened. She hated that he knew her pathetic, miserable history. She hated that he held the ledger of her life. "I bought you because of the debt," Gabriel murmured, his eyes slipping shut again. "But they hit my house tonight, because I insulted Declan's crew by taking the street trash instead of the prime cut." Harper froze. The air in her lungs turned to ice. "They came here because of me." Gabriel let out a tired, cynical exhale. "No, they came here because I wanted a war, and taking you was the match. You aren't the center of the universe, Harper. You're just the excuse." The brutal honesty hit her like a physical blow. He hadn't saved her out of nobility. He had used her as a pawn in a mob war. She was still just a prop. Before she could process the stinging betrayal, heavy footsteps sounded in the bedroom. "Mr. Faust!" Dr. Gibson's panicked voice echoed off the tile. The doctor rushed into the bathroom, carrying 2 large black trauma bags. He took one look at the bloody scene on the floor and shoved Harper out of the way. "Get out!" Gibson barked, tearing open a sterile pack of gauze. "Martha, bring boiling water and the surgical lamps from the basement." Harper scrambled backward until her back hit the bathroom door. She looked at her hands. They were coated in Gabriel's blood, drying fast, turning into a sticky, rust-colored crust. She looked at Gabriel, his eyes closed, his face entirely pale, as the doctor began cutting his shirt away. She turned and fled. The next 3 days were a masterclass in psychological torture. The house smelled entirely of industrial bleach and copper. Men in unmarked coveralls came and went at all hours, hauling away shattered wood, stained rugs, and dragging heavy black contractor bags out the back door. No one spoke. Harper stayed in her room. She scrubbed Gabriel's blood out from under her fingernails until her cuticles bled, but she still smelled it. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the dead man with the ruined throat in the hallway. She saw Gabriel bleeding on the floor, telling her she was nothing but a match to start his fire. Martha brought her meals, but the housekeeper looked exhausted, her grey hair escaping its tight bun, dark circles hollowing out her eyes. On the 4th morning, the lock on Harper's door clicked. She was sitting on the window seat, wrapped in a blanket, watching a team of men repair the shattered wrought-iron gates in the distance. Martha stepped in. "He wants to see you. In the office." Harper didn't ask questions. She dropped the blanket, smoothed down her grey sweatpants, and walked out of the room. The hallway was pristine again. New plaster, new paint. It was as if the violence had been scrubbed from the very timeline of the house. She walked down the grand staircase and approached the heavy double oak doors at the end of the west wing, the forbidden wing. She knocked once. "Come in." Gabriel's voice was steady, lacking the raspy exhaustion from the night of the attack. Harper pushed the heavy door open. The office was cavernous, smelling of old leather, cigar smoke, and expensive scotch. Bookshelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Behind a massive mahogany desk sat Gabriel. He looked entirely put back together. He wore a crisp black dress shirt, though he was missing the jacket and tie. He moved a little stiffly, favoring his right side, but the hollow, dead look in his eyes was back. The predatory machine had rebooted. Sitting on the desk in front of him was a thick, brown manila envelope and a black canvas duffel bag. Gabriel gestured to one of the leather chairs opposite him. "Sit." Harper walked forward, her bare feet silent on the Persian rug. She sank into the chair, gripping the armrests. Gabriel slid the manila envelope across the polished wood. "Declan is dead," Gabriel said flatly. His tone was conversational, as if discussing the weather. "I had his throat cut in a parking garage in Brooklyn yesterday morning. His brothers have gone to ground. The war is over." Harper stared at the envelope. Her heart gave a strange, erratic flutter. "Okay, inside that envelope is a passport," Gabriel continued, leaning back in his chair, his dark eyes fixed on her face. "The name is different, but the photo is you. There is a plane ticket to Seattle, leaving out of Titerboro in 4 hours. In the duffel bag is $250,000 in unmarked, non-sequential bills." Harper stopped breathing. The air in the room suddenly felt too thin. She looked from the envelope to the bag, then up to Gabriel's impassive face. "Why?" she croaked. "The debt is paid," Gabriel said simply. "Your grandfather's favor is squared. I used you to bait Declan into breaking the treaty. He took the bait. I won the territory. You served your purpose." He wasn't gloating. He wasn't being cruel. It was pure, unadulterated business. "You're a liability here," Gabriel added, his voice dropping a fraction of an octave. "You flinch at shadows. You shake when doors open. You don't belong in this world, Harper. Take the money. Disappear. Build a quiet life where you don't have to smell blood in your hallways." Harper stared at the canvas bag. $250,000. It was more money than her entire bloodline had ever seen in 3 generations. She could buy a small house. She could open her own diner. She could sleep without locking her door. She could leave the monster behind. She reached out, her fingers trembling lightly, and rested her hand on the rough canvas of the duffel bag. It was heavy. It felt like freedom. She looked up. Gabriel was watching her hand. His face was a mask of cold indifference, but she noticed the microscopic tightening of the muscle in his jaw, the slight, almost imperceptible grip his fingers had on the edge of the mahogany desk. He was holding his breath. Harper pulled her hand back. The memory of the bathroom flashed in her mind. His hand crushing her wrist. The raw, unprotected look in his eyes when he asked her why she didn't run. The realization that the cold, dead mafia boss was just a man who expected everyone to eventually leave him. She thought about Seattle. She thought about being a waitress again, constantly looking over her shoulder, wondering if Arthur would track her down, wondering if some new predator would see a weak, isolated girl and decide she was easy prey. Freedom was a myth for women like her. There was only the street or the cage, and this cage had walls thick enough to keep the wolves out. "No," Harper said. Her voice was quiet, but it didn't shake. Gabriel's eyes snapped up to hers. The mask cracked. A flicker of genuine confusion passed over his features. "Excuse me?" I said no, Harper repeated. She sat up straighter in the leather chair, letting go of the armrests. "I don't know anyone in Seattle. I don't know how to launder $250,000. I'd be dead or robbed in a month." Gabriel leaned forward, ignoring the pull on his stitched side. "Harper, do not be stupid. I am handing you your life back." "My life was a joke," she shot back, a sudden fierce heat rising in her chest. "My life was starving to pay off my father's bets. My life was getting backhanded by drunks and sold in a meat cellar." She stood up. She didn't cower. She walked right up to the edge of the desk, looking down at him. "You told me you didn't buy me to beat me," Harper said, her voice dropping to a low, raw pitch. "You told me you were the monster who keeps this house quiet. You told them I was yours." Gabriel stared at her, the amber flecks in his eyes catching the light from the desk lamp. His chest rose and fell in a heavy, measured rhythm. "I am a violent man, Harper. If you stay in this house, you will see things that will rot your soul. You will never leave these gates without an armed guard. You will belong to a ghost." "I was already a ghost," she whispered, leaning her hands on the mahogany, closing the distance between them. "I'll take the guards. I'll take the walls. I'll take the violence, as long as it's not aimed at me." She reached out, her fingers brushing past the duffel bag of money, and pushed the manila envelope containing the passport off the desk. It hit the floor with a soft, final thud. "You looked at me in that basement," Harper said, quoting the words that had sealed her fate. "And you said, 'She'll do. I'll take her.'" Gabriel's eyes darkened, a heavy, consuming shadow swallowing the amber. The air in the office grew incredibly thick, crackling with an unspoken, dangerous tension. "And now?" he asked, his voice a gravelly scrape. Harper didn't flinch. She looked the monster dead in the eye and finally accepted the reality of her broken, twisted world. She didn't want a hero. She needed a shield. "Now," Harper breathed, "I'm telling you to keep me." Gabriel stared at her for a long, suffocating minute. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of the contract they were silently signing. No romance, no flowery promises, just two damaged people agreeing to share the dark. Slowly, Gabriel reached across the desk. He didn't grab her wrist this time. He laced his fingers through hers, his calloused, scarred hand swallowing her small, pale one. His grip was firm, anchoring her to the mahogany, to the room, to him. "Martha," Gabriel called out, his voice ringing through the heavy oak doors behind Harper. The door clicked open immediately. "Yes, Mr. Faust?" the housekeeper asked, stepping into the threshold. Gabriel didn't look away from Harper's eyes. His thumb brushed over her knuckles, a slow, possessive slide of rough skin. "Take the bag to the vault," Gabriel ordered, "and lock the front gates. No one gets in or out without my explicit permission. Harper is home." Martha bowed her head. "Understood, sir." The heavy oak doors closed, the latch clicking with a solid, echoing finality. Harper stood there, her hand trapped in the grip of the city's most dangerous man. The scent of cigar smoke and expensive scotch filled her lungs. She wasn't free. She would never be free. But as she looked down into the dark, hollow eyes of Gabriel Faust, she realized she wasn't cold anymore. If Harper's shocking choice left you breathless, hit that like button right now. Did she make the smartest move for her survival, or did she just lock herself in a cage she'll eventually regret? We want to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and tell us what you would have done with that bag of cash. Share this gripping finale with anyone who loves a dark, twisted romance, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next intense audio drama. The story might be over, but the darkness is just beginning.